So, okay. So let me remove the spotlight. That was just about half an hour. I hope that was okay. So I'm happy to do Q&A on this, and I will unspotlight myself, and I'll just answer Q&A as well as I can. Okay, Michael, go for it, sir. Oops, he just disappeared.
So,
oh, there we go.
So that was very interesting. So I especially enjoyed the last part because it seemed to suggest the source of what we might be observing there. It appeared what he was playing with there is what's called a klystron. You ever heard of that?
Yeah, I believe so.
Microwave oven.
Yeah, and now that was later. I'm not sure. So what I can tell you about John's equipment is he has had 2 up to 3 Tesla coils going together simultaneously, not always, but sometimes. He has worked with Van de Graaff generators. He has also worked with naval broadcast equipment, right? Stuff that should never be fired up inside of a house. But so he's worked with a lot of different stuff. The klystron is an additional piece. He would have to be the one who tell you how often he used all of those together. What I can tell you is, again, the piece to remember is his stuff is primarily electrostatic. There's very little, like he's not using a lot of magnetic coils. The closest he gets to a coil is like a Tesla coil, right? So it's primarily electrostatic, and it is in a building that is packed to the rim with metal. So whatever kind of field effect he's creating is incredibly complex because it's all re-radiating.
So when you say static, you're not saying he's applying direct current. It looked to me like he was using AC.
He's using both. He's using both. And if I remember right, I think the effect has happened most often when he's using like a Van de Graaff, which puts a DC bias on like the entire room, right? So you use a Van de Graaff, and then you use then he would use the Tesla coils also, you know. And he also had tunable. One of the things that they talked about was he had tunable knobs on some of the radio equipment, and he would say he would start to turn the dial and the effect would happen, you know. So one of the things that and the reason I mention that is Colonel John Alexander from SRI, and I think John was working with the CIA at that time too or something. They sent a team in the 1980s to investigate what was going on there. And they spent, if I remember right, about a week with them. And they saw the effect happen, if I remember right. That they wrote a report on it and said at the time, in fact, what did they call it? I think there was a story written about it called the poltergeist machine. They believed that it was some kind of a machine enhanced psychic power, if that makes sense. And what I had said to them was, I'd said, because I'd talked to John about this later, and I said, why did you pick that? Well, part of it was at the time, SRI was getting paid to find psychic stuff. So everything they found became psychic, right? That was, yeah, you know, that was part of it. That was, you know, they were the remote viewing guys. So they were psychic everything. But the other part was I felt like I've known people who were hands-on, and like when John is turning those dials, he could, you know what I mean? He could feel, yeah, you know, and that's not just him, that's any machinist, right? My ex-wife, my first wife's father was a machinist. He could turn a dial and know when to stop turning it by hand. Yeah. And that's something that no PhD physicist is going to know.
I know, you got to do it. You got to actually do it.
Yeah.
It's a failure thing, you know. You gotta fail over and over and over and over and over again, and then finally get it right. And then you have to repeat it. And it's the repeating part that's the most difficult. It's going back and getting it to do it again. Okay. And so, but my other observation was that when you looked at a ferromagnetic material like steel or iron, or if you looked at aluminum, which is not ferromagnetic, it's, you know, you can't pick it up with a magnet. The non-ferromagnetic materials look like they're the ones that showed the domain structure.
Yeah.
The ones that the ferromagnetic materials, they were amorphous. And when you looked up close, it looked almost like it had melted at the molecular level. You know
Well,
what
and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the only theory, and George Hathaway experimented with this too. He went away from this idea, and I never understood why. But so chemical bonds are all electrical, right? I mean, when you get down to it, chemical bonds are all electrical, and it's all based on valence orbitals. It's all based on that outer band electrons, right? And they share electrons, even in metals.
right?
And my thought was, just like a microwave oven, if you have enough frequencies and resonances and it's random, you might be able to bump those valence electrons out of position, and you would permanently bump them, right? Because, so the orbital might be here, but you're shifting that orbital over here. It can't bond chemically. So you might have a solid that would turn into a jelly.
So I'm curious if they weighed these objects before and after the Hutchison effect. And was there any effect on the weight? So the reason I'm asking that is it almost appears like for the example where you, before and after with the aluminum bar, you have a higher concentration of the dopants after. It's almost like the aluminum is disappearing somewhere.
It's possible.
Away, but I would think that would show up in the weight of the thing after. So do you know if there was any before and after measurement of the material weight?
That I don't know about.
I don't want to monopolize my time. So
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, let me go to Aiden, did you have something? Because I'm getting some echo.
Yeah, a couple. Did that in one of the photos with the aluminum in the bar, it looked like there were the little dots. So did you see any of the photos that that correlate to Bob Greenyer's presentation and the EVOs? Because I mean that was a very he did get into Hutchison stuff. And then the other thing was like circa 2013-14, there was a Hutchison video of like a bar on paper towel, and then it just goes and it disappears and shrinks, and I mean it's gellifying, but I can't find it anymore. So yeah, those are my questions.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna mute you out temporarily because I was just getting really bad echo. So yeah, oops, sorry about that. In terms of, let me see. I didn't see the more recent video, the 2014 one. I haven't seen that at all, so I can't speak to that. The paper towel that you mentioned. And sorry, what was the first question again? I just blanked out.
EVOs, Bob Greenyer's EVOs, and it briefly in one of the slides where you're doing a close-up of either like the wood or the aluminum with a knife in it, you could see these little, I mean, it looks like there were little dots or trails or something going through the metal, which would be a second data point for Greenyer's presentation and hypothesis, or it, so.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Let me, I just muted you out so I could answer. So with EVOs, that is not something that I know about, but what I can tell you is, historically speaking, because I was on all these news lists. So not Bob Greenyer, I think he came later, but Ken Shoulders and John Hutchison were like best friends. These guys emailed each other 4 or 5 times a day for like years. I mean, so Ken Shoulders and John Hutchison, so you might ask John about that, and John would probably say yes. He could probably give you a ton of information on EVOs, because he was really close with Ken Shoulders. So I hope that answers the. Let me go to Charles. Charles, go for it, sir.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. I'm a big fan of John Hutchison. I've tried to convince him the Graviflyer is the Hutchison effect, but he's not convinced yet. I did see on his eBay channel before it went down, he was selling some of the samples. I actually bought some for $150. I wanted to buy the wrench from him, but he sent these other samples free. And they're, like you mentioned, some of the files that are strangely magnetic. and
Okay, so
others-
that file, I wonder if that's one of the ones that was glowing.
Possibly, yeah. I haven't been able to see it in the video, but and they've also kind of cut off some of the edges that have already been where it broke. So I can't really compare it to some of the videos to see which one it is. But yeah, in the future, I plan to study it under scanning electron microscope at my university as part of my PhD in electrical engineering. But right now the university's kind of closed down, so it's hard to
Yeah,
get
I know.
into to
I
study
know.
it. But did he ever offer to sell you any of his parts then when you saw him?
You know,
That's my question.
I think he offered to give me some. If I remember right, he offered to give me some, but I declined. To be honest, I wouldn't want to separate his collection. I know that sounds weird, but he's got, you know what I mean? This was several years ago though, and he was doing a lot more TV and radio. This was before he sold his lab, before he moved. So things are kind of in a different position now, but yeah, I think if I remember right, he offered to give me some, and I said, well, really for me, the photos were more valuable. That was the value, you know. And the thing that was exciting for me was that was the first time I was aware of that anybody really took the time to do close-up photos on the metals. So
Yeah, I know he's been trying to sell them on eBay, but they recently took down his eBay after about 2,000 objects sold and 100% feedback. But it was some issues with his paperwork. EBay updated their rules for what can be allowed to have an account, so he didn't qualify anymore. But he's still selling them on his Facebook. If you
Oh,
go to
I was gonna say-
Hutchison Lab Investigations, you can reach him.
yeah, I was just trying to think like what eBay rule would that violate? It'd probably violate all of them, you know. I know
National security.
strange alien parts that have been modified by Lord knows what, you know. But no, it's cool that you got some of the samples. I would bet you if you put them under an electron microscope, at the very least, you would find massive disruption. What my gut tells me is that it's electron orbitals, right? It's like sticking it in a microwave oven, more or less, except that it's at high enough frequencies. And it's not just one that you would have to affect. You would have to affect probably, you know, like in iron, you'd probably have to affect like 10 or 20. And then depending on how much of it gets affected, they can't bond and it behaves like a jelly or a liquid, you know. And then of course, the minute you turn the field off or it moves outside of its sweet spot, then those orbitals bounce back to normal and nobody can tell what happened, you know. So let me go to Mark next. Mark,
You should let poor Gordon, because he's holding his hand up physically.
where is he at? Oh, Gordon. Okay, let's go to Gordon then. Gordon.
That's better. Unmute myself. Hi, Tim.
Okay.
Yeah, you kind of touched on what I was going to ask with a comment you made there. My sort of knowledge area is materials sciences and stuff like that. One of the things that immediately struck me looking at the images was there seems to be some sort of potential induced form of non-Newtonian rheological behavior. In other words, what you're doing is changing a solid into a different format with some sort of phase shift that's induced, and then it goes back to being that solid in a different format, and then the whole structure of the thing has been interfered with and messed about with to appear then in the state that it appears. And you might even find that the whole sort of metallurgy of the thing has actually even changed if you were to
I would imagine, yeah.
That is extremely interesting. That's probably what these CIA guys were interested in, because the potentials for a directed defense or attack weapon of some sort that could adopt that or include that would be of extreme interest to military side, I would have thought.
I think, yeah, I would agree with that. I think what's more interesting is if you could imagine being able to weld metals with no welds.
Yeah.
Right. Or construct an airframe out of one solid piece of metal, right? By just bending it and shaping it, you know. And so So yeah, I think, I mean, that was kind of where I ended up, was if it was the
Mm.
electron orbitals, and you could basically, it was like you were simulating different materials, and maybe you could be simulating materials that never even existed, you know, simulating new substances, right? Because if you can make iron behave like it's half this or half that or something like that, then it's something new. So yeah,
You can do that with products at the moment. A product that I had a lot of experience in optics, and one of the products I've been involved with in the last few years and no longer involved with it is a contact lens. You stick it in your eye. Inside that contact lens is a material substance that's semi-solid. And then what happens is when your heat of the body actually hits it, eye movement and pressure actually uses that non-Newtonian rheological principle to actually change it into a dry eye drop, which is then fed into your eye.
oh, there you go.
That's very similar to the
Yeah.
sort of metamorphosis change that's happening in these images you actually got there.
Well, the other thing that is interesting, I think is very notable, is so when I got into John's work seems to be very closely related to the Philadelphia experiment, the way it was reported, right? Now again, that's you know, that's our modern day Flying Dutchman tale, so it's hard to know how much is true and how much isn't, but it is interesting that the Philadelphia experiment story started in the 1950s, and the main outline for it was written in the 50s, and then in the book in the 70s, it was written down by Berlitz and Moore. And so here John comes 5-10 years later, and he's actually demonstrating the same effects using similar
Phase
equipment.
change, and you've got these stories of guys that have actually come
Melted into the deck. Yeah.
melted into the ship. Yeah.
You know, and it is very well documented that they tried something on the Eldridge. You know, in fact, the ship, I have photos. Maybe I'll do a presentation on that. They have photos of the Eldridge. It's still, even after the military surplused it and sold it, it ended up with the Greek shipping company. They had enormous power cables, like enormous conduits. We're talking like, I don't know, 8-inch copper cables, right? Like, and they would just been sliced off because something had been removed from the ship. This was on the outside of it. And then on the inside of the ship, I do know, I'm digressing a little bit, but people ask why the Eldridge, right? Why would the US military pick that destroyer escort? It was actually one of the first electric drive ships that the Navy made. And if I remember right, they had something like 200 megawatt generators. And so what you could do is you could actually redirect those generators. I think they were turbo diesels. You could redirect those to a coil system, and they had a coil system on it. It looks like they added more, but it originally started with, it had enabled degaussing coils in it. So the entire body of the ship was wrapped in coils. So yeah, there were a
Tesla
lot.
and Einstein that was supposed to be involved in that experiment from memory.
Yeah, and there was a lot of research that went into it. And in fact, John Hutchison worked with, I forgot his name. He was one of the guys from the Ghost Hunters program. One of the questions was, what was the Navy trying to do? And they said, well, they were trying to make a ship invisible to X-band radar, and they were trying to do that by impedance matching on the hull, right? And so John and this other fellow tested that with a scale model, and they tested it with a block of iron, and they were able to do that. They were able to impedance match and make it invisible to the K-band radar, if I remember right, that was in use at the time. I think today is X-band, and that wouldn't work. But for World War II radar, yeah, they were able to make it invisible. So. Okay, well, let me say thank you, and let me go to Bernie after this. Bernie, go for it, sir.
Hello, thank you. Sorry about that. That was an awesome presentation, and I am very jealous that you got to go to John's work lab back in the day there.
Well, thank you. I'll try and do something in the future that's more organized. I just wasn't sure how to.
You're being way too hard on yourself, Tim. You were. It was an amazing presentation. I don't think anybody can argue that. I've been talking to John Baroness Carla Knipchen Hutchinson on his latest YouTube channel, and he's agreed to come on to my podcast here, and I'll try to arrange it with Jeremy so that we can do a joint interview. And seeing how it is 2022, don't be scared off by John's cross-dressing. I have a character called Crypto Bender that is a fembot that is a half female mannequin, half Bender head. So hopefully he's comfortable with that. Whatever, who knows, right? It's like, even if you're exposing yourself to that sort of radiation, how it might affect the mind, right?
That's good. That's a good point. Yeah, that is. He has definitely absorbed a lot of RF over the years. There's no doubt about that.
Right. So
well, yeah, that's good. I would say send us over the link, right? Send us over when you get him up on your podcast. Send us over the link.
Yeah, ahead of time I'll arrange it. So I'll try to get you on there too, Tim, for sure.
Everything that I talked about today is really old material. I mean, I know he's done several things in the last few years. I haven't stayed up on it. I talk to him occasionally. I've been trying to get him to come on, and he has said sooner or later he will, but
I'll talk him into it. I'll twist his arm, or
it's
Carla's, either or.
It's been over a year at this point, so I just said heck with it. I'll just put the photos out. So.
But yeah, in the past just the week alone, he's posted a video of him salvaging on a diesel submarine as well as a destroyer. So wherever he's based right now, one of the navies is helping him out and letting him take some pretty high-end material there. So
okay,
it will be good to get updates from him.
Well, Bernie, thank you. So let me go to Harold next, sir.
Yes, excellent presentation, good information.
Well, thank you.
My question, I have a two-part question. The first part is, when those pieces of metal are lifting up in the mid-air, well, it looks like an anti-gravity effect, something like that. I mean, have anybody theorized about that?
Yeah, so in fact, one of the first, it's kind of one of the more famous papers that was written about it. George Hathaway wrote it. It was called the Hutchison Effect, a lift and disrupt system. So it's interesting that when you mentioned it lifting up, that's exactly what George called it, a lift and disrupt system. The disrupt was the jellification part of it. And what's interesting is, I've got my theories about the material samples, right? I could be right, I could be wrong. I have never heard any good theory about the anti-gravity effect. I've never even heard a bad theory. I mean, nobody has a good guess. I can tell you the skeptics have said that they flipped the room upside down, which seems a little ridiculous, or they simulated a room in a box and flipped that, which seems equally ridiculous. And it's also not practical. It wouldn't explain, for instance, you have waters, or not water, you have liquids that flow. You saw one of them. You saw a liquid that was flowing against gravity. But it started to do that from the ground, right? And so it's, if you flipped a room upside down, it would just fall out, but that's not what happens.
Yeah, my second question is that, does anybody theorize that might be used for either for a gravity generation, let's say in a spaceship? You know how it floats up, but if you put it on the other way, that means that in the vacuum of a space, it will form, for example, gravity effect, in which the astronaut, for example, on the spaceship would be feeling the effect of gravity because something is pulling those up. The same thing can be done.
Yeah. I think it would be easy to use that if it was more understood. And again, I've just never heard a good, I mean, I think when you have something like the Hutchison effect, part of it is everybody likes to grab examples like that to prove their own theory, right? So you've got 20 or 30 different people who are like, that's the Hutchison effect. That's what I'm doing. That's why my thing works, and they use him as an example. But I've never seen anyone dig into it and say, this is why this levitation effect happens. What I can tell you is it affects metals, plastics, it affects liquids, solids. I mean, it seems to affect all sorts of different things.
Tim,